Hello, and welcome to HistoFlick Double Bill, the podcast where we take two historical films and pit them against each other to see which is more accurate. My name is Joe,
And I'm Max.
and on this episode, we'll be looking at the life and music of Bob Dylan by looking at the 2007 film I'm Not There, which is directed by Todd Haynes.
And James Mangold's 2024 A Complete Unknown.
Now, we are by no means Bob Dylan experts, so we have Laura from the Definitely Dylan podcast, who is an expert on all things Dylan, on speed dial, and we will both be able to call her at moments to ask her a question and hope that she backs off our point. So, Max, are you ready to go electric?
Let's do it. Now, Joe, this debate is anything but straightforward. I think these two films are trying to achieve very different things. And whereas A Complete Unknown is more that standard biopic, I think your film is more artistic. Would you agree with that?
Oh, I mean, I'm Not There. It's a very art house indie film. It's not your traditional, Bohemian Rhapsody, Rocketman-esque biopic in the way A Complete Unknown is. But I think it's interesting to see the different aspects of Dylan's life which it prosecutes and it finds itself concerned with. So you've got 6 different narratives going on in I'm Not There. So bear with me, it's a little difficult to keep track of. First of all, you've got Arthur Rimbaud, who's played by Ben Whishaw of Paddington fame, of James Bond fame, who is a poet, a young poet being interrogated, and he gives very lyrical responses to the questions he's being asked. Then you've got Woody Guthrie, who, unlike the real Woody Guthrie, is a 12-year-old African-American boy played by Marcus Carl Franklin on the run from a town called Riddle, who's run out trying to fulfill his dreams. There's a certain mystique about who he is. He's got a bit of a murky past, similar to perhaps Dylan himself in changing his name. And that's supposed to represent... he represents the Dylan that left his small town to go and ultimately meet Woody Guthrie, which is portrayed in A Complete Unknown. Then you've also got Jack Rollins, who is played by Christian Bale, and who is the folk musician side of Dylan, who's the kind of the most similar, I'd say, to Timothy Chalamet in A Complete Unknown. It covers the same early span of Dylan's life, and it covers a little bit of his downfall, but we get more into his downfall later with Jude Quinn, who rather remarkably in I'm Not There is played almost uncannily by Kate Blanchett, which you would never think, and she represents the going electric side of Bob Dylan, which emerged in 1965, which A Complete Unknown covers. Obviously, kind of its latter half is focused on the turmoil created by Dylan deciding to transition his music style, whereas that's just one segment, probably the most lengthy segment of I'm Not There, but it is one segment, and the remaining two, you've got Heath Ledger, the late Heath Ledger, playing Robbie Clark, who's an actor, and that kind of allows us to probe more of Bob Dylan's personal lives, his relationships, and his attitudes then. And then you've also got Richard Gere, the legendary Richard Gere, playing Billy McCarthy, who is Billy the Kid, and represents kind of the Western side of Bob Dylan, of his music. And of course, Billy the Kid was character in Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, the Sam Peckinpah film, in which Bob Dylan provided one of his most famous songs, Knocking on Heaven's Door. And then, so that's I'm Not There. You have the much more straightforward task of telling me about The Complete Unknown.
Yeah, straightforward, and I would argue actually more accurate film. A Complete Unknown stars Timothy Chalamet in an Oscar-nominated role, and I think this performance is absolutely deserving of that. He captures everything that I think you could want from a performance of Bob Dylan. He gets the voice down, he gets the mannerisms to a T, even the way he looks, whilst that's not hidden necessarily, but the sideburns, the hair, the kind of demeanor that he carries himself with. That's all. That's all what I know to be Bob Dylan. Um, and you mentioned a lot of names there and a lot of layers to the character. I think Timothy Chalamet does all of that and more just in his one performance. You talked a little bit about the background of Bob Dylan and how he constantly changes his name. The film, A Complete Unknown, references that with Sylvie Rousseau. She finds his like personal writings, and it's under the name Bob Zimmerman. You get the kind of constant reference to him working at the fair and that kind of thing of the past of his music isn't well known. He's also got a relationship with Gucci, like you mentioned, and that's a big part of it. It's him constantly coming in to check with him whenever he feels unsure or whenever a pivotal moment in the film happens. He's kind of that the play his place of refuge, and I think all of those elements together, they pay a really wonderful homage to what Bob Dylan is and that period of his life. Obviously, it takes place from the early 1960s and his rise as a folk music superstar, and kind of the highs and lows of that, both in his personal life and public-facing life, and the frustrations that really come with that, and him wanting to, put out this message, civil rights and all those things that he's so famous for talking about. He feels like he's being controlled by his his position, the reason for his fame, and being based on the 2015 book Dylan Goes Electric. I think it's really interesting to get into the mind of Dylan and why he made that major change at Newport Film Festival when he debuted his rock album.
Well, I think the role of Newport Folk Festival is obviously slightly diminished in I'm Not There Because I'm Not There spans so many different eras of Dylan. I think for me that makes for a better representation of Dylan the artist, who this mercurial talent who has had so many different lives as an artist. Obviously, he came to the forefront of American culture, particularly in the early part of the 1960s, in 61 or 62, I believe. Um, Taking over the folk scene, launching it to the stratosphere, uh, obviously capitalizing on the success of Woody Frey. And I think I'm Not There effectively captures these different fragments of Dylan's life in a much more engaging in a much more engaging way than A Complete Unknown, which I think in which Dylan becomes this traditional biopic protagonist, which just doesn't you can't sum up such a unique, such a versatile talent into just one man, because he had led so many different lives, and A Complete Unknown tends to suggest that he's a very neat character, I'd say, and it makes him neat and understandable to the viewers, to the audience. But he was far from that. Nobody understood what was going on in his head at the time. Nobody understood his decision to go electric. And yet, A Complete Unknown seems to think that you can reason with it. Whereas in the fragmented storytelling with 6 different narratives ongoing, you get a greater glimpse in I'm Not There of of that kind of just mental strangeness almost, that he is so he's existing on almost this other plane of existence to those around him. And he's spent decades kind of avoiding this straightforward interpretation because he was far from straightforward. He's not the conventional young genius that A Complete Unknown paints him as. And I mean, I think for that reason, I'm Not There properly, it gets the core of Dylan. While not obviously Dylan is not 6 different faces in a literal sense. He is in many ways 6 with more personalities, and I think I Know There grasps at that in incredibly intricate and interesting ways. And I think we should let's call Laura and see what she thinks about this. Yeah. Hi, Laura. We're just discussing kind of how Bob Dylan's been portrayed in those two films, A Complete Unknown and I'm Not There, I think we both find I'm Not There's approach with six different figures interesting. But Max thinks that the single Timothy Chalamet performance gets to the heart of who Dylan was more. What do you think?
The Timothy Chalamet biopic, A Complete Unknown tells a pretty coherent story. It's very, narratively linear, but it is also, I want to say this, I think it is a very nuanced film. And I think this is in part because of when it was made, but the people who it was made by, the fact that it is based on a really great nonfiction book by Elijah Wald called Dylan Goes Electric. It is a really good film, and I think it is obviously led by a really strong actor with a really strong performance, and the music is good, is well done. So I think if anyone wants to see a film about Bob Dylan and they're not very familiar with Bob Dylan, I think A Complete Unknown is a really good way in. They were trying to not resort to cliches too much, to not just tell the old kind of trodden out story of Dylan fell out with the folkies and kind of turned his back on them and went electric. I think they were trying and succeeding, I think, to be a bit more nuanced with it. And I think that is one of the strengths of the film. I'm Not There is very different. This is a film for Dylan nerds. If you're a Bob Dylan fan or fanatic, you will be on the edge of your seat because there's so many little Easter eggs, so many references. I'm Not There is really a film about the Bob Dylan myth. It really is a film about how Bob Dylan is being talked about, the different images that have been created, that culture has kind of come up with to try and get to the bottom of who Bob Dylan is. I think that that's a really, really interesting way to get at an artist who has always been private, who has been I think there's this idea of Bob Dylan as an enigma, and I think I'm Not There really leans into that. Just alone the fact that people know there's a movie that exists where there are 6 or 7 versions of Bob Dylan played by different actors, including, a black young boy and Kate Blanchett as a woman, playing into the androgynous side of Bob Dylan. I think that really helped shape culture's idea of Bob Dylan.
Well, pretty much as expected then. It's not quite so black and white. But one thing I'd like to add to that is just how music is used in both films. Obviously, it's going to be central. It's a film about a musician, one of the most famous musicians of the past 100 years. I think that I'm Not There interprets Bob Dylan's music in a much more Dylan-esque way. I think that because it has different performers, each performer kind of reinterprets Dylan's songs as their own. So you'll get Christian Bale doing his folk, his own kind of folk twang on Dylan, and I think that better represents Dylan as a man. And in the film, music, Not There, it is not treated as a greatest hits soundtrack. Whereas in A Complete Unknown, it's just like, you've got to get this song in there, you've got to get this song in there, you've got to get this song in there. It's so intent on getting all of the songs that people recognize in there. Don't Think Twice, It's All Right, like a Rolling Stone. It's so intent on getting those in there. It crabs in the Rolling Stone twice, and Blowing in the Wind, 3 times maybe, that it plays almost as a greatest hit soundtrack, whereas I'm Not There uses his music in a much more organic way, a much more creative way as well, I think. And in using that music, I think Chalamet, it's an impressive performance. I have no qualms with the fact that he was nominated for an Oscar for it and that you got much critical acclaim. I think it's a good performance, but it's a good performance at recreating Dylan. I don't think it's a performance that understands who Dylan was. I don't think a performance that gets the ethos of who Dylan was as a performer and as a person. I think he's merely recreating. rather than understanding.
See, that's where I disagree with you, because I feel that, yes, you could argue that they do get all those great hits in there. But I feel like you need an element of that kind of fan service in a Bob Dylan biopic. And you got to think of the audience it's presented to. It's for fans of Bob Dylan that are there to come and listen to the reason that they support the artist. And it would be, I think, not only inconsiderate to that audience, but also kind of reductive of Bob Dylan to not mention those. And I don't think they're necessarily crammed in. I think that they're used in very pivotal moments and very important events in Bob Dylan's life to illustrate what he was feeling in those years. And I think this idea or the suggestion that Timothée Chalamet's performance is more one note or less gritty than what you get in I'm Not There is false, because I feel like what we get from Timothée Chalamet's Bob Dylan is that kind of, imperfect, kind of dirty growth of a man consumed by his talent, who really knows he can make it, and the kind of sacrifices he has to make, both in his own personal life and especially those relationships around him, in order to make it come true. And I think that's something else I want to talk about, is those people closest to Bob Dylan. So, Joe, one of the key things that I found with A Complete Unknown is the portrayal of Bob Dylan as this kind of unsavory character in elements of his relationships with those closest to him. So, first of all, before we get into some of the other personalities, and believe me, there are some big personalities in this film, I think the most pivotal characters are those that come in this kind of love triangle. It's at the heart of the film, and that's between Bob Dylan and Elle Fanning's Sylvie Rousseau, who in real life is the counterpart of Bob Dylan's early 60s muse, Susie Rottola. And of course, we've got Joan Baez, who, amazing singer-songwriter in her own respect, and really helped Bob Dylan early in his career. And we see that kind of relationship reflected in the film. But before I get into that, I really want to just kind of, hark back to Elle Fanning in this film. I think her performance was masterful. I thought she really, really captured the kind of being shadowed out by Bob Dylan's, amazing kind of public persona, and her struggle to maintain her relationship with Bob. The two dated from 1961 until 1965, and that's shown in the film. And the reasons, I think, could have been delved into a little bit more for their eventual breakup. I think this is one point I would concede, that it does get a little bit one note in the fact that she feels like his relationship with Joan has kind of, moved him away from her, that he's got these bigger dreams, bigger aspirations that he can't, that she can't quite, be compatible with. But I think the reality of it was far more different, in the fact that in Bob Dylan's ballad Plain D, which he released in, the years after their relationship, he explores some more of those elements, the kind of family dynamic that he had with Rottola's sisters, and how that caused an issue. And what I think the film does capture in that respect is Bob Dylan's arrogance and his kind of ignorance to the feelings of those around him that don't fulfill his own aspirations. And in that particular instance, Bob Dylan would reflect in the decades following, and he would similarly show a disdain for that kind of reaction from him. And that leads me to my next point, is the fact that if we're talking about historical accuracy, Bob Dylan served as an advisor on this film, and he actually acted out the entire script himself in advance of the film, coming to fruition. So I think, one, credit to Bob Dylan. I think it takes real character to explore those darker elements of your own past and really reflect on those mistakes that you made. And two, if anyone is going to know the true reality of what happened, it's the man who lived it, right?
Yes, that's so certainly going to be the case. But that's where I think I'm Not There deviates from A Complete Unknown. I'm Not There is an interpretation of Dylan. It doesn't attempt to be an exact reenactment. It's the interpretation of his life, his music, rather than straight reenactment, in the way that A Complete Unknown portrays his relationships with Joan Baez and Susie Rousseau. Sylvia Russo, sorry, for the film, and Susie Rotolo in real life. And I think that's where I'm Not There, it becomes more about how you yourself interpret Dylan in the film, because it's almost at times difficult to see the supporting figures from a complete unknown within I'm Not There. I mean, personally, I think you can interpret Susie Rotolo as being Julianne Moore's Alice Fabian character. We don't get too much of an insight into her. She's speaks to the camera in Talking Heads, like it's a documentary. But we sense that there's a relationship that went awry long ago. That there's, a sense of melancholy about her and about the way that relationship panned out. But yet she still admires him, still treasures what she helped bring into the world in his music. And I think that's rather interesting, and that's portrayed through Julianne Moore and her characters, Talking Heads, speaking about Christine Bell's fragment of Dylan, shall we say. And then, obviously, everybody knows the much rumors and much gossiped about relationship between Joan Baez and Bob Dylan in the 60s, and rumors and speculation around their relationships, which lasted right up until, well, they reunited in the 70s for his Rolling Thunder Revue tour alongside Eric Clapton and other music icons. And that kind of the fascination in their relationship, I think, in A Complete Unknown, she's kind of glossed over as a tool in which to advance his story. She's much more a stepping stone than I think, than she was in reality. Whereas I think in I'm Not There, you can kind of interpret the character of Claire, played by Charlotte Gainsbourg. You can interpret her as emblematic of Joan Baez. Again, there's certain aspects where I'm Not There, the numerous love affairs that Bob Dylan enjoyed in the 60s, 70s, or whatnot, kind of compressed into very few characters. But you can interpret Claire as Joan Baez, and then again, I think that in doing so, the women in I'm Not There, they aren't simply stepping stone characters. Their emotions are properly explored. Much of the narrative, which focuses on Heath Ledger's fragment of Dylan, Robbie Clark, the actor, is actually much more centered around Claire, around Charlotte Gainsbourg, and it encapsulates their relationship in a rather beautiful, melancholic way in which she exposes the cost that comes with Dylan's, continuing self-invention, and she's aware of it. And there's still fondness between them, which I think is critical if you're going to interpret Claire as Joan. I think it's critical to understand that there is still there's a fondness that exists to this day between the two. Though they don't talk, though they probably haven't seen each other in years, there's still fondness. And I think in that aspect, the relationships in I'm Not There with Dylan's muses, his relationships with partners, they're not so messy as perhaps they were in reality, and certainly as they are in A Complete Unknown, but they are more interesting in understanding what these women meant to Dylan, and in what their relationship with Dylan brought out of the women themselves. They are not merely pawns in his story. They have their own complete narratives.
Yeah, I could see that, but I would say I think a lot of that comes down to the angle that the film has taken. A Complete Unknown obviously follows Bob Dylan, so the other elements of those characters are only going to come into the story to serve the purpose of the plot. And whilst, yes, that does end up flattening a few characters and kind of misconstrues some elements of their personalities, I still think the writing itself is really quite brilliant in the way that Joan Baez is this strong and independent character that doesn't really put up with Timothy Chalamet's, Bob Dylan's kind of his self-invention and his staying up late at night in one scene in her apartment after they obviously spend the night together, and he's, you know, playing the guitar and keeping her up and she's not having it. And I think those elements of Joan Baez's character in real life really permeate through the film, and she's one element where I think she really helps to ground the story, because you can see in some of more Timothy Chalamet's recent performances, like with Marty Supreme, everyone around him is kind of feeding that ego, and she really rips it away from Bob Dylan in every scene that she's in with him. And I think she even steals some scenes. I think that Monica Barbaro's performance was brilliant, and the kind of subtle nuance of the character, the references to how she had this public reputation for having never smiled, and I thought the scenes where she was smiling were also really significant in the way that they happen in critical moments in that relationship, and I think they were sporadic but chosen extremely carefully by the filmmakers.
I think that's a fair point. I think the scene in which they're both performing at the Newport Folk Festival for the final time in a complete unknown, it is rather beautiful. I think it's a very well done scene. And I think that scene itself encapsulates much of their relationship. I think it's a rather less inspired portrait of their relationship than in I'm Not There, but I still think it's a relationship which is well explored, fairly well explored, at the very least. That being said, I take a little bit of umbrage with the characterization of other maybe supporting characters in A Complete Unknown. I think Pete Seeger's he's this wholesome guy. He's this wholesome guy without much of a dark side to him. Is that necessarily the case? He's very much a one note character. He's not got the level of depth which any man, let alone a remarkable musician in his own right, is going to hold. But I know you disagree on that.
Well, yeah, I think Pete Seeger, whilst you could say that he's, you know, kind of reduced to this wholesome figure in Bob Dylan's life, I think he almost takes on this kind of allegorical responsibility for what folk music is to Bob Dylan. It's what gives him his start. It's this kind of comforting element of his life. And the same way that the relationship becomes strayed at Newport in 1965, and they obviously they go their separate ways, I feel like that shows Bob Dylan breaking out on his own and you know, going on this new uncharted path that was rock music for him. And that relationship is central to the film, and I think you could argue maybe in some instances it's, you know, reduced or kind of simplified, but I think you have to do that for the audience to truly understand the core importance of that character.
There are very few supporting characters in I'm Not There, given that you have 6. On Bob Dylan's, there's not much space on the screen for many other characters. One of the ones that I think does deserve a mention, I'd say, is the unknown fictionalized journalist who's kind of represents a slew of journalists who speculated about Dylan's private life in the 60s and 70s. He is the Mr. Jones of Ballad of a Thin Man, and he's played by Bruce Greenwood in the film, who also plays Pat Garrett, the other half of Pat Garrett, and Billy the Kid. Pat Garrett being the mean law enforcer, and I think that kind of exploration of the pressures that the media put on Dylan through this one character then all comes together rather remarkably in this incredible concert gig performance in London, in which reality becomes heightened for and this is with Jude Quinn's Kate Blanchett's Dylan, and Bruce Greenwood kind of embodies the skepticism that surrounded Dylan and his route to going electric. and I think that's probably the standout supporting character in I'm Not There, barring obviously the central woman, Alice Fabian, and Claire, his two lovers in the film. But the issue is, I don't know if I'm Not There, which A Complete Unknown does not have, is that Woody Guthrie in I'm Not There is Bob Dylan, and so it's much harder to represent the actual Woody Guthrie story. Whereas I think that's something you think A Complete Unknown does very well.
Well, that's what we think. Should we see what Laura has to say? And obviously, she knows better than us. Hi, Laura. We're just discussing the kind of, support cast of both films and how they really affects Bob Dylan's life. Which one do you think was more accurate in its portrayal of those surrounding characters?
I think it's always like creative choices that the filmmakers have to make. And if you're asking me, I mean, I'm glad that I wasn't in their shoes, because I think those are often like really difficult decisions that you have to contend with. I think there were certain things in A Complete Unknown that, if you're familiar with the story, there might just be like a little question mark. Certain figures that were important in the Dylan story overall, but were not like super relevant to that particular story that they were telling. I mean, whether that's other folk musicians from around that time, or the Beatles, or the fact that they placed the remark when someone shouted Judas at the Newport Folk Festival, when it really happened in the year after in the UK, or the fact that Bob Dylan already was with the woman who would go on to be his wife, Sarah. But the thing is, I understand why they decided to leave all of those things out, because I think it would have muddled, again, what they were trying to go for, which was a more concise narrative. And again, I'm Not There had so much more freedom, so I think they could bring so many allusions into the film by just hinting at something or by just quoting something, and there's so much in there. I mean, it was really such a dense film. As I was rewatching it, I was reminded that like one aspect of I'm Not There that I personally don't love, and I'm probably alone in that, like I'm not a big fan of we're gonna go on record with this. I don't know, but I don't really love the interaction with Michelle Williams's character, who is obviously supposed to be Edie Sedgwick. I don't love that, and I also don't really think that like Bob Dylan and Edie Sedgwick had that kind of relationship. But it's a creative choice, so yeah. I mean, in A Complete Unknown, I think they really tried to show that the relationships that Bob Dylan had with women were, let's call them complex. That he wasn't always nice to them, and there are many reasons for that. But I'm certainly not going to make any excuses for him. Um, I think I think the Joan Baez character is great in A Complete Unknown. I think they really, I love that they give her kind of almost a redemption arc, and that she's portrayed as the strong and confident character, really in her own strength, and with her own very flourishing career, as it was back then. And I mean, she did really help get him out to a larger audience, and he didn't really reciprocate, which was not nice of him. Um, so I like the way that she is portrayed. I'm a big fan of Joan Baez in A Complete Unknown. I think the other character, Sylvie, who is based on Bob Dylan's girlfriend Susie Rotolo, I think she, I think that she was not as interesting as the real life Susie was. Susie was an artist in her own right, and really uh, played such a crucial role in exposing Bob Dylan to a lot of art early on in his career. And I think she really kind of took him by the hand and introduced him to a lot of politics and music and art. And but again, that could be a film in its own right almost. So I think she got flattened, and I've sometimes wondered whether that was maybe one reason why they renamed her, in addition to the fact that, I mean, I think someone said the fact that she wasn't a public figure is why they changed her name. But then again, Susie Rotolo wrote a great book called A Free Wheel in Time about her life in Greenwich Village in the early 60s, including her relationship with Bob Dylan. So it's not like she was a completely private person, because she is also an author. And for anyone who is interested in that time, and also Bob Dylan's relationship with women, and what the real life Susie was about, I really can only recommend that book, A Free Will in Time, because that is beautiful and a great read and fascinating.
Okay. So it's as I thought. It's a lot more colourful than the simple accuracy debate. The women and the support characters in Bob Dylan's life can't just be reduced to the history books, and I think that's something both films do get right, and it's something we can both agree on. One pivotal element of Joan Baez and Bob Dylan's relationship are those scenes at Newport Folk Festival, and I think we should discuss that a little bit. Obviously, there's a lot more of a traditional interpretation of the folk festival in my film, but what would you say about?
I think it's very interesting, and I'm not there. I mean, it's not at all really like reality. You've got Kate Blanchett's Jude Quinn, and you've got machine guns going off everywhere. It's surreal. It is not at all indicative of reality. But I think what it's portraying is an interpretation of the way in which Bob Dylan transitioned from his traditional folk music to going electric, to incorporating the electric guitar in his music, little bits of rock and roll, like bands like the Kinks, who is inspired by, and it captures the way in which that kind of tension between the traditional folk crowd and Dylan, and his own want and desire to move away from that style of music, and the way in which it portrays that, it's very fascinating, and I think it's a very clear interpretation, and it gets right the tensions and emotions that were going on during that festival.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think it's even more so in my film, where in A Complete Unknown, you really get that feeling that Newport Folk Festival is somewhere that is almost like a battleground for Dylan, and it's somewhere where he really plants his flag in the ground, and he takes his territory. And I thought the scene right at the climax of the film, right at the end, where he does that transition to rock, is so crucial in showing the whole dichotomy of Bob Dylan's career. And you get that initial kind of backlash from the fans and people hating it, throwing things at him. And then when he finishes his performance, even though you've got this kind of shell-shocked environment, everyone's a little bit shaken by what's just happened, you see people in the crowd, clapping and laughing and having a good time. And I think that's reflective of what Bob Dylan did in his career. He shocked people. He said things that, some people didn't want to hear, but ultimately he's celebrating, and I think that's the strength of both of these films.
Oh, certainly. I think, yeah, and they're both, no doubt, strong portraits of Dylan's life, but they just take very different approaches to that storytelling. I think personally, yeah, they're both strong pieces of filmmaking. But should we get a final verdict of which one paints the more accurate picture of Dylan by calling Laura one last time?
Yeah, of course.
Hi, Laura. Let's just reach final verdict. I'm Not There or A Complete Unknown. Which one gets Dylan best?
I mean, to be honest, if someone was interested in getting into Bob Dylan, I think I would recommend that they watch Don't Look Back, the documentary about Bob Dylan's UK tour in 1965, and No Direction Home, the Scorsese biopic, which covers vaguely the same period as A Complete Unknown. I think for someone who just wants to get into Bob Dylan and kind of understand what it is about him, I think I would say that those are better vehicles to introduce them. But if they definitely want to watch kind of like a fiction film, then maybe A Complete Unknown. But then, like, once they fall down the rabbit hole and become obsessed, then I would say at some point watch I'm Not There, because you're gonna get a kick out of it if if you're already a little bit obsessed, if you already know a couple of things, because then it'll be really fun to watch.
Okay, well, maybe A Complete Unknown, yes, a more accurate portrayal of Dylan's life. But the music, I maintain, I'm Not There, is a better portrayal.
But if someone was coming to, discover Bob Dylan for the first time, it would have to be A Complete Unknown. I feel like introducing someone off the bat to the intricacies of Dylan's character is only going to muddle the true history and really confuse people. I do agree that the film is useful and it has its reason for existing, and the artistic interpretation is something that I think, Bob Dylan fanatics will, come to love. But in terms of telling the true story in the most simplistic form and still being able to bring out the true character of Dylan through the film, Complete Unknown is easily the winner for me.
So we're saying Complete Unknown as the gateway to Dylan, and I'm Not There as where you turn when you become a true Dylan aficionado, maybe.
I would agree with that.
Okay, that's what we think, but what do you guys think? Let us know on all our social medias at HistoFlick on
Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, everywhere that you get your podcasts. Our website is HistoFlick.com, and of course, our Letterboxd.
Yes, and let us know what you'd like to see in the next episode. Which historical figure, which historical event would you like to see us cover? Let us know.
But that's all from us.
Bye.